Stop what you're doing right now because what happened across the United States this week has atmospheric scientists using phrases they've never used before in their entire careers. On Tuesday, January 7th, 2026, Houston, Texas hit 82 degrees Fahrenheit. That same day, meteorologists were tracking a polar vortex disruption so strong that one senior researcher opened his model data and literally sat up straighter in his chair, later telling colleagues, quote, "This one looks different." At the 4-minute mark, I'll reveal why meteorologists are whispering the same phrase in internal chat rooms, a phrase that signals something genuinely unprecedented is unfolding. By minute 8, you'll understand how the same atmospheric pattern is producing 82-degree heat in Texas while simultaneously preparing to unleash Arctic air so extreme it hasn't been displaced this far south this early in January since 1968. And at minute 12, I'll show you why Climate Central's analysis concluded that what you're experiencing right now has been made 1.5 to 5 times more likely by climate change, and what that means for the next 30 days of your life. Here's a number that should immediately grab your attention and illustrate why the phrase "never happened before" isn't hyperbole, but scientific observation. On January 7th, 2026, 31 weather observation stations across the Rio Grande Valley of Texas either set new temperature records or came within tenths of a degree of breaking records that have stood for decades. Brian Hurley, a meteorologist at NOAA's Weather Prediction Center, used a word that forecasters reserve for genuinely significant events when he said, quote, "That's significant," end quote. But here's what makes this extraordinary rather than merely unusual. Those record temperatures occurred while temperatures were running 20 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit above local January averages, meaning this wasn't a brief, warm spike, but a sustained departure from normal, so extreme that residents in South Texas in January were turning on their air conditioners. Let me be absolutely clear about what makes this situation genuinely unprecedented in the modern meteorological record. It's not that we've never seen warm January days in the South. It's not that polar vortex disruptions are new. It's the simultaneous occurrence of both extremes driven by a single atmospheric pattern, combined with the timing, the intensity, and what atmospheric scientists are seeing in the data that has never quite looked like this before. When Houston hit 82 degrees on Tuesday, that tied records. When forecasts showed Houston could reach 85 degrees by Wednesday, that would break the city's all-time warmest January temperature ever recorded, a record set just 4 years ago in 2022. The fact that we're threatening to break a record that itself broke a record from decades prior tells you the climate baseline isn't just shifting gradually, it's accelerating in ways that make each new extreme redefine what's possible. But while the South sweltered in unseasonable heat, something far more ominous was developing 30,000 feet above the Arctic Circle. Multiple independent research teams began detecting what they're calling a highly unusual January polar vortex disruption, with experts emphasizing that, quote, "This year's event is exceptionally strong," end quote. Another analysis published within the last week states that, quote, "The intensity is nearly unprecedented for January," end quote. To understand why this language matters, you need to understand that meteorologists are trained to be conservative in their assessments. They use terms like unusual and rare frequently. But when multiple independent sources start using phrases like exceptionally strong, nearly unprecedented, and almost unheard of in modern weather records, that signals something is occurring that falls outside the normal range of atmospheric behavior that current forecasting paradigms were designed to handle. Here's the timeline of transformation that demonstrates how this unprecedented pattern developed and why it caught even veteran atmospheric scientists by surprise. Early December 2025, stratospheric temperatures above the Arctic begin rising in what meteorologists identify as the early stages of a sudden stratospheric warming event. This type of warming happens almost every winter, but what made this one different was the timing and intensity. Atmospheric scientist Judah Cohen, who tracks these events as part of his research, opened modeled data one morning and saw warming signals that would normally appear in late January or February showing up in mid-December. He later told colleagues that seeing such a strong disruption This early, quote, felt like watching a quiet chess game where someone suddenly flips the board, end quote. Late December 2025 into early January 2026, the stratospheric disruption begins propagating downward through the atmospheric column, a process that typically takes 2 to 6 weeks. But this event moved faster and more aggressively than historical precedent. The polar vortex, that massive circulation of cold air that normally spins in a tight formation above the North Pole, began buckling and displacing. By early January, forecast models showed something that made meteorologists start whispering among themselves. Internal chat rooms and professional Slack channels carried the same three-word phrase over and over: "This one looks different." January 6th through 8th, 2026, the surface manifestation of the stratospheric chaos arrived, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of immediate Arctic blasts, the atmospheric pressure pattern set up a ridge of high pressure over the eastern United States that pulled Gulf moisture and warmth northward with extraordinary intensity. On Tuesday, January 7th, the record started falling. Houston hit 82 degrees. Tulsa, Oklahoma reached 74 degrees. Baton Rouge, Louisiana climbed to 81 degrees. These weren't just warm days. These were temperatures that defied the entire concept of January, winter weather, across a region home to tens of millions of Americans. But here's what the computer models and atmospheric observations revealed that truly separates this event from historical warm spells. The same pattern that was producing record January heat in Texas was simultaneously positioning a core of the polar vortex to plunge into North America within days. Analysis from Severe Weather Europe published just 3 weeks ago shows that, quote, by the end of the year and into 2026, the atmospheric pressure waves will shift, clipping a core of the polar vortex and sending it into the eastern United States with a strong northerly jet stream, end quote. This type of rapid transition from extreme warmth to extreme cold, driven by the same atmospheric configuration, represents weather whiplash on a scale that strains infrastructure, ecosystems, and human adaptation capacity. Now let me explain the atmospheric physics behind why this pattern has meteorologists using phrases like "never happened before," and "this one looks different," because understanding the mechanism reveals why this isn't just another weather event, but a signal of fundamental atmospheric change. The polar vortex exists because of a simple principle. Temperature contrast creates pressure gradients, and pressure gradients combined with Earth's rotation generate wind. During normal winters, cold air accumulates over the polar regions, creating a tight circulation that keeps that cold air confined at high latitudes. The jet stream at lower altitudes follows a generally westerly path, guiding storm systems from the Pacific across North America toward the Atlantic. But when a sudden stratospheric warming event occurs with the intensity we're seeing now, it disrupts this entire system from the top down. Temperatures in the stratosphere above the Arctic can spike by 50 degrees Celsius in just days, creating a thermal shock wave that destabilizes the polar vortex circulation. When the vortex weakens or displaces, all that pent-up Arctic air that was confined over the pole suddenly has no atmospheric barrier preventing it from surging south. Meanwhile, at the surface, the jet stream develops extreme waves and kinks, creating what meteorologists call blocking patterns. These blocks can stall weather systems in place, producing the persistent conditions that lead to record-breaking extremes, whether heat, cold, drought, or flooding. What makes this particular event unprecedented isn't just that these processes are occurring. It's the combination of factors happening simultaneously with intensities that exceed historical precedent. The stratospheric warming event began earlier than typical. The subsequent polar vortex displacement is stronger than usual for early January. The surface temperature anomalies produced by the resulting atmospheric configuration are more extreme than climatology would predict. And all of this is occurring against a background climate that's already 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial averages, providing additional energy that amplifies every extreme. For those of you over 30, you can probably remember a time when January meant consistently cold weather in the north, mild but stable conditions in the south, and weather patterns that persisted for weeks rather than flip-flopping every few days. That atmospheric stability has disappeared, replaced by a regime where temperature swings of 40 to 50 degrees can occur in 24 to 48 hours, where record heat and record cold can affect the same region within the same week, and where the language we use to describe weather, terms like normal and average, have lost meaningful connection to what you actually experience day to day. Here's what the data tells us about how unprecedented this January pattern actually is, using multiple independent metrics that allow for objective comparison to historical records. Metric 1, temperature departures from climatological averages. Scientific American's analysis published 3 days ago noted that South Texas temperatures were running 20 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit above local January averages. To put that in perspective, a 10-degree departure is considered notable. A 20-degree departure is rare. Sustained 30 to 35-degree departures across a region home to millions represent conditions so far outside normal variability that statistical analysis would classify them as multi-standard deviation events, the kind that should occur perhaps once every several decades rather than multiple times within a single week. Metric 2, record-breaking frequency. When 31 observation stations in a single region set or threaten records simultaneously, that signals a systemic atmospheric pattern rather than random local variations. The National Weather Service maintains temperature records going back to the late 1800s for many locations. When you're threatening to break records set in 2022, which themselves broke records from the 20th century, the trend line is clear. The climate baseline is shifting faster than infrastructure, ecosystems, and human planning can adapt. Metric 3, climate attribution analysis. Climate Central's Climate Shift Index, a peer-reviewed methodology that quantifies how much human-caused climate change has altered the probability of specific weather events, calculated that the January 2026 heat wave affecting the South has been made anywhere from 1.5 to 5 times more likely because of climate change, depending on location and specific date. This isn't speculation or modeling projection. This is statistical analysis of actual observations compared to what would have been expected in a world without human greenhouse gas emissions. When scientists tell you that what you're experiencing has been made up to 5 times more likely by climate change, that's not political rhetoric, that's mathematical reality. Now let me reveal why meteorologists are whispering, "This one looks different," in their internal communications, and what that phrase actually means for the weather you'll experience over the next 30 days. When atmospheric scientists with decades of experience look at modeled data every single day and something makes them stop and take notice, that something matters. The specific phrase, "this one looks different," appears in a published analysis from just 1 week ago, attributed to conversations meteorologists were having among themselves as they watched this polar vortex disruption develop. The phrase captures a reality that's difficult to communicate in formal scientific language. Sometimes you see patterns in atmospheric data that don't quite match anything in the historical record, configurations that fall outside the box of what your training and experience prepared you to interpret. What makes this January pattern look different comes down to several specific factors that atmospheric scientists are tracking. First, the timing of the stratospheric warming event occurring in mid-December rather than late January or February. Second, the intensity of the polar vortex displacement showing up in ensemble forecast data. Third, the rapidity with which surface temperature patterns swung from cold to record warmth to forecasted extreme cold again. Fourth, the geographic extent of the impacts, affecting everywhere from Texas to Wisconsin to the Northeast Corridor. Fifth, and perhaps most concerning, the degree to which current computer models are struggling to predict the pattern's evolution beyond 5 to 7 days, indicating atmospheric chaos that exceeds the model's ability to resolve. This last point deserves emphasis because it directly affects your ability to plan over the next month. When forecast confidence is high, meteorologists can give you reliable 10 to 14-day outlooks that help you make decisions about travel, business operations, agricultural scheduling, and personal planning. When forecast confidence is low because atmospheric patterns don't match historical analogs that models were trained on, that predictability collapses. You end up in a situation where Tuesday's forecast looks completely different from Monday's forecast, not because meteorologists are incompetent, but because the atmosphere itself is in a chaotic state where small initial condition errors cascade into large forecast divergences. Here's what the next 30 days look like based on current understanding, acknowledging that uncertainty is higher than normal and forecasts will likely shift as new data arrives. Week 1, January 11th through 17th. The record warmth currently affecting the South will break down as the atmospheric ridge shifts position. By midweek, the Arctic air begins infiltrating the central United States as the displaced polar vortex core moves into North America. The Canadian long-range model updated just today shows cold air support over western Canada and the northern and central United States strengthening by week's end. Temperatures will crash from the 80s in Texas to potentially the 20s and 30s within 72 to 96 hours. This rapid transition creates black ice conditions, strains heating systems that were barely running during the warm spell, and catches unprepared residents off guard. Week 2, January 18th through 24th. The Arctic outbreak intensifies across the eastern two-thirds of the United States. Forecast models show sub-zero actual air temperatures, not wind chill, across the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. The polar vortex core that displaced southward creates a source region for Arctic air that sits deeper in the polar circle than typical January cold snaps, meaning the air mass will be colder and more persistent than what climatology would suggest for mid-January. Lake effect snow becomes a major factor across the Great Lakes as Arctic air moves over relatively warm water, potentially producing feet of snow in traditional snowbelt locations. The Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic face uncertainty about whether this Arctic air interacts with coastal moisture to produce winter storms, with the difference between major impacts and minor impacts hinging on details that won't resolve until days before potential events. Week 3 and 4, late January into early February, ensemble forecasts show continued cold air support over the northern United States, with the Canadian seasonal model indicating that February 2026 could maintain this cold bias. The pattern becomes self-reinforcing as snow cover expands across Canada and the northern United States, reflecting sunlight and maintaining cold temperatures. Blocking patterns develop across Greenland and the North Atlantic, steering storm systems on unusual tracks and maintaining the overall cold regime longer than typical January patterns would persist. But here's the critical caveat that separates responsible meteorology from sensationalism. While the broad pattern of Arctic air displacement and subsequent cold outbreak is highly confident, the specific details of timing, intensity, and location remain uncertain precisely because this atmospheric configuration looks different from historical precedent. Computer models trained primarily on 20th century climate data struggle to accurately predict patterns that increasingly fall outside that training data set. This means you should prepare for the likely scenario, prolonged cold and increased storm potential, while maintaining the flexibility to adapt as forecasts evolve daily. Now let me address what this unprecedented January pattern means for your daily life, your family's safety, and your community's resilience over the next month. The temperature whiplash from 80-degree heat to potential sub-zero cold within days creates cascading challenges that affect every system you depend on. Heating systems that barely ran during the warm spell will suddenly face maximum demand when Arctic air arrives, stressing mechanical components and potentially revealing maintenance issues at the worst possible time. Water pipes in homes, particularly those in exterior walls or unheated spaces, face freeze risk when temperatures plunge rapidly because the gradual cold adaptation that normally occurs in typical winters doesn't happen. Transportation infrastructure faces compounding stress as roads go from dry to wet during the transition, then freeze rapidly when cold air arrives, creating black ice conditions that are invisible and deadly. The soil hasn't frozen gradually as it would in normal winter progression, meaning when surface temperatures crash, the temperature differential between relatively warm soil and Arctic surface air creates enhanced fog and freezing fog, further degrading visibility and travel safety. Power grids experience demand spikes that operators struggle to meet because their forecasting assumed more gradual seasonal progression rather than temperature jumps of 50 to 60 degrees in 72 hours. For agricultural operations across the affected region, this pattern creates potentially catastrophic conditions. Fruit trees and perennial plants that began breaking dormancy during the record warmth will suffer severe damage when Arctic air arrives. The timing couldn't be worse, as plants fooled by January heat into thinking spring had arrived will have no time to reharden before extreme cold hits. Livestock operations face challenges managing animals through temperature swings that exceed what husbandry practices were designed to handle. Overwintering insect populations experience die-offs that could affect pollination and pest dynamics through the entire 2026 growing season. Economic impacts radiate through every sector. Retail businesses that stocked spring merchandise, assuming mild January weather, face inventory that won't move when Arctic blasts arrive. Energy companies that projected heating demand based on seasonal norms find themselves short on supply when actual demand spikes higher. Construction projects that continued operating during the warm spell face sudden shutdowns when temperatures crash, idling crews and equipment while overhead costs continue. Transportation and logistics companies face route disruptions, increased fuel costs, and delayed deliveries that cascade through just-in-time supply chains not designed to handle rapid weather transitions. The insurance industry faces claim spikes from burst pipes, weather-related vehicle accidents, and storm damage if Arctic air interacts with coastal moisture to produce winter storms. Each extreme weather event pushes premiums higher for everyone as companies adjust risk models to account for increasing frequency of unprecedented patterns. Municipal governments strain budgets dealing with emergency snow removal, treating icy roads, operating warming shelters, and maintaining essential services during conditions that fall outside normal winter operations planning. Here's something that almost nobody discusses, but profoundly affects quality of life and mental health across affected populations. The psychological impact of weather whiplash creates a different kind of stress than predictable seasonal changes. When you experience 80-degree weather on Tuesday and forecasts show potential for sub-zero cold by the following Tuesday, your brain struggles to process the disconnect between what you're experiencing and what you're preparing for. You make decisions about clothing, heating, travel, and activities in a state of cognitive dissonance where your immediate sensory experience contradicts the forecast information telling you extreme change is imminent. This disconnect compounds with each successive unprecedented weather event. People start to distrust forecasts because their lived experience keeps surprising them, even though the forecasts were often correct but simply predicting patterns that seem too extreme to be believable. This creates a dangerous dynamic where warnings of genuinely life-threatening conditions get dismissed because they sound like hyperbole, when in fact they represent accurate assessments of atmospheric states that have never occurred before in modern records. Communities need to develop new mental models for processing weather information in an era where unprecedented has become the new normal rather than a once-in-a-lifetime exception. For parents with children, this presents unique challenges. How do you explain to kids that they wore shorts to school on Monday but need full winter gear by Friday? How do you maintain routine and stability when the environment itself becomes radically unstable? How do you teach preparedness and caution without creating anxiety about forces beyond anyone's control? These questions don't have easy answers, but they represent the lived reality of climate disruption in ways that abstract discussions of global mean temperature change never capture. The three most critical preparation steps you must take right now, today, before this pattern evolution continues, are these. First, complete a full inventory of your winter emergency supplies regardless of current warm conditions. Don't let 80-degree weather fool you into complacency. You need 2 weeks of non-perishable food, 1 gallon of water per person per day, full prescriptions for all medications, alternative heating that doesn't depend on electricity, flashlights, batteries, hand crank, or battery-powered radio, and first aid supplies. When Arctic air arrives and potentially interacts with storm systems, you may face power outages lasting days in sub-zero temperatures. Preparation now, while conditions are still manageable, could literally save your life next week. Second, protect your home's infrastructure against rapid temperature crashes. Know where your main water shutoff valve is located and how to use it. Insulate pipes in vulnerable locations. Ensure heating systems are functioning properly and have backup plans if primary heat fails. Clear gutters and downspouts so ice dams don't form when temperatures plummet. Bring in outdoor decorations or items that could become projectiles in high winds. These aren't optional, nice-to-have preparations. These are essential protections against cascade failures when unprecedented weather pushes systems beyond their design limits. Third, adjust your mindset from planning for average January weather to preparing for extreme variability that could swing 50 to 60 degrees within days. Cancel non-essential travel during the transition period when conditions will be most unpredictable and dangerous. Build flexibility into work schedules and commitments so you're not forced into risky decisions when weather deteriorates faster than forecasts predicted. Establish communication protocols with family and neighbors so you can check on vulnerable individuals when conditions become challenging. Stock vehicles with full winter emergency kits, including blankets, food, water, and supplies to survive if stranded, because the highways that were dry and safe today could become ice-covered parking lots by next week. The broader implication of this unprecedented January pattern extends beyond this particular week or month. We're witnessing in real time what climate scientists have been predicting for decades. Not a gradual warming where every day gets slightly hotter, but increasing variability and intensity of extremes where record heat and record cold both become more frequent, where atmospheric circulation patterns become more chaotic and less predictable, where the concept of normal weather loses meaning because the baseline keeps shifting faster than adaptation can keep pace. Atmospheric scientists started whispering, "This one looks different," because their training and experience didn't prepare them for patterns that fall outside historical bounds. The January 2026 combination of record heat, exceptionally strong polar vortex disruption, and forecasted extreme cold transition represents weather that has quite literally never happened before in modern meteorological records. Not similar events, not comparable patterns, but the specific combination of factors occurring with this timing and intensity. The question isn't whether unprecedented weather will continue. It will. The question is whether communities, infrastructure, and individuals will adapt fast enough to maintain safety and resilience as unprecedented becomes routine. The answer to that question depends on decisions being made right now by policymakers, infrastructure operators, and everyday people like you, deciding whether to take warnings seriously or to gamble that this time the forecasts are wrong. Meteorologists are seeing something they've never seen before. They're using language they've never used before. They're struggling to predict patterns that don't match anything in their training or experience. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't clickbait. This is the atmospheric reality of January 2026. And what you do with this information over the next 72 hours could determine whether you navigate the coming pattern transition safely or become another statistic of weather that looks different because it is different, unprecedented in ways that matter profoundly for every aspect of modern life that depends on atmospheric stability we no longer have.